The sad skald sings, a story he sows, about Turin the timid, this terrible travel of his. Beginning in white winter, a weighty fellow is he, all packed and prepared, the porky pig parted. Leaving hearth and home, he left heavy-hearted. The first step was foul, foretelling it all. He bashed his big bum, and blistered his thumb. Then the lad left, limping away. Young Turin trekked on, till the sun turned away. In a clearing he camped, upon cursed land, by a big broad bog, where bugs would hunt. They stung and they sucked, all night he was stuck. A growling and grievous night, our guy left at first light. He woke up weakened, darkness waned, departing and darting, leaving only dust. Crossing a river roaring, ripped his pants. The current carried him far, he cruised off a cliff. Wet and weary and worn out Turin was, lost all his luggage, a long ways from home. He wobbled and waddled through wind and rain.
Hey there, Grade 5. This is Mr. B, and we're going to have a lesson on Anglo-Saxon and Norse poetry. So we chose to do this medieval legends thing during our Viking unit, and this is going to be kind of one of our little tie-ins here. So obviously, when we're doing medieval legends, most of the legends are from around this time when the Anglo-Saxons and Norse people were about, and during the Viking Age. A lot of the stories, like Beowulf, comes directly from the Viking Age, and so it's quite fun to read these stories that the people, the Vikings, would have been listening to and hearing. And so poetry was a big form of how people communicated. And today we're just going to look a little bit about how Viking poetry and Anglo-Saxon poetry is constructed. So at least in general. Now, one first thing to note before we get into it is that Anglo-Saxon or this type of poetry was meant to be read aloud, right? So you were meant to say it out loud, and just basically the way that it would be like telling a story. And people, if we remember back to our last book study, Sign of the Beaver, we remember that Etienne would tell a story to his family around a fire, and this is the exact same thing that people all over the world would do. And they would tell stories, and it's really important that we do tell stories. And as Christians, we have the greatest story to tell of all, the story of Jesus and his coming and the salvation that he brought, right? So we have a story to tell of the world that has fallen, and that how we've sinned, and then a Savior was sent who came and died in our place and gave us salvation and forgiveness and mercy. Now our story is a true story, but some of these stories as well that we read and we hear from the Anglo-Saxons and Norse can also have interesting tales and just interesting meanings and things that we can maybe learn from them in a sense. Like the story we read about the other day with Siegfried and Belmong and the sword and the horse, and that was an interesting story. And some things that we could learn there is the importance of toil and hard work, and how his parents didn't want Siegfried to grow up kind of weak and just living an easy life. They wanted him to understand that that life is not just a free ride, and that you have to work hard. And so we can see some of the virtues in these stories, right? These stories aren't totally evil because they weren't written by Christians. They have lessons and things that can be learned as well. Now, often with Christians, we call this common grace, that the Lord doesn't abandon other people completely to their sins, though he does to a degree, but he also upholds them, and he still, like, the law is still written on everyone's heart in a sense, that they know what is right. And even though they don't, as we can see practically from the Vikings and how they raid and pillage, that they weren't obviously living a sinless life of when they're murdering and stuff and stealing, definitely break the commandments. We can see that they still did have display some virtue. Now, we always recognize that this virtue is often meaningless in the face of God and His law, and that if you break one commandment, you're guilty of the whole law. Normally the virtues that they display are in a sense vain, and they're corrupted by sin. But we can still see that they had good thoughts and good ideas, and there was a bit of light shining through, even though it was covered in mire and dirt. But I digress. So, Old Anglo-Saxon. So, if you look at this little page beside us here, you'll notice, and we'll see on the next page as well, that we can't read a thing of that. And maybe if you take some time, sometimes you can pull together a few words here and there, but it's often quite hard. It's very different from English today. Now, English is basically, you can see angle there, and it's just Anglish, and then English. So it has sort of come down from the old Anglo-Saxon, and there's other languages like French that have been mixed in there, and so it's not a pure descendant of Anglo-Saxon, but it has over the years. And even if you look to the time of Shakespeare, even his English, which is only 400 years ago, is getting quite different from our own. And so, Anglo-Saxon being a language that's spoken in Britain 1,000 years ago is very different. But there are some people alive today who can translate this, thankfully. But one interesting thing to note is that the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons, their languages weren't actually too different. Now, of course, they couldn't just totally speak to each other, but there was a lot of common words and commonalities, so they could have probably communicated. And when we remember a few lessons ago in our Vikings unit that these guys came from around the same region, right? A lot of the Anglo-Saxons came from Jutland or Jylland in Danish, and that is, we have the Jutes as well, and the Anglos and the Saxons. They all came from the Denmark area, and so it's not too surprising that their language was not that different from the Norse people who came later from that same general region. I just have these funny words. Get out of here. Here, get out. You're out, get. And, anyways. So here's Beowulf. There's the first kind of little bit of Beowulf. And as you might have noticed, as you noticed, we can't really read that. But just based on our own, we could learn to read it. But it's quite different. But one thing that we can notice is letters that pop up again and again, or multiple times in a sentence, right? Or more often than not. And when we translate this, some people have translated it to actually reflect this, and this is called alliteration. So I'll just read this to you here. Hear the song of spear Danes from sunken years. Kings had courage then, the kings of all tribes. We have heard their heroics. We hold them in memory. Shield Chiefson was one, scourge of all tribes. Took 'em all to mead benches, mangled his enemies. He rose, and in rising, he wrecked all his foes. So this is what we call alliteration. An alliteration, as we will get here, is where you have repeating sounds at the start of a word. And it can also be stressed syllables inside of words sometimes. It doesn't always need to be there, so right at the beginning. But Yeah, alliteration is a grammatical thing that makes the sentences sound more fun and pleasing to the ear. And it also connects words together more closely because you can tell that the author is trying, at least hopefully is trying, to kind of attach these words and make sure that they're carefully linked. So this is used very heavily in the epic poems of the Norse and Anglo-Saxon people. So alliteration does not always, that's something else, alliteration does not always require the same letter, but it's the same sound, right? So we see rising and wrecked, right? It's the same sound because the W there is basically silent. You still have the R. And then again in kings and courage, right? They're the same K sound. And so it alliterates, right? And remember that these things are often spoken rather than read. So that's why it's the sound that matters more than the actual writing, right? So yeah, we can have some alliteration here, like bring the book to the bookcase, come clean your chair. Greta gathered green gumballs. Peter planted peonies in the pot. Larry's lazy lizard lays like a lump, right? Those are alliterations. So you can see that these are fun sentences, right? And yeah, they can be quite a bit of fun. And this is used a lot, and you can see it basically, well, not basically. Oh, I have to do this again. Attack! Run away. We see that they're basically used in every sentence. And again, not basically, they are used in every single sentence in Beowulf. They have this alliteration to them, and it makes it a fun read. And it's a really neat style of writing. So we'll go here to the next big thing that we need to learn. Stitches and hemistitches. So each line in an Anglo-Saxon Norse poem is called a stitch. Now it sounds exactly like a stitch with a T there, but this is a linguistic kind of term. So it's just a stitch and a hemistitch. And so it's divided into two hemistitches. So just before we get anywhere else, you can look on the side there, and it's usually divided by a comma or maybe a space. Right, so we see here the location of learning, the great lesson hall. That is a stitch, the full thing, and on each side are hemistitches. Now you can see the alliteration that goes through. So the big thing that connects them is this alliteration. The other thing is that each stitch is talking about one thing, and it's made up of two hemistitches, which a hemi is like hemisphere. Right, that's like half of the world. We live in the Western Hemisphere, and some people live in the Eastern Hemisphere, and that just means half. So yeah, it's a half stitch, basically, is what you could say. And each half stitch is kind of talking about the same thing, right? It's the same thing said twice, and it kind of gives you, like, it really emphasizes the point. Now, in Hebrew poetry, they do other things similarly. They repeat words. Or repeat the idea again and again. So in Norse poetry, they repeat it, or they don't repeat the same word. They give the same idea kind of spelt out in two different ways. So the location of learning, that could be called a school. The great lesson hall can also be called a school, right? So you have these hemistitches, and they're put together, they're in a sense stitched together by the fact that you have the alliteration running through it. So you have location, learning, and then lesson, which kind of ties it all together. It reminds you that these are working together to provide you this picture, right, of what the school is. And so, yeah, because the location of learning, it might only give you a part of it, right? It could be outside, it could be anywhere, location of learning. But then when you get a great lesson hall, now you're starting to have more of a picture of a school building, right? So I think it's a really cool thing. And then so in Beowulf, you can have this kind of stitch here: great trials and tempests, long times of deep suffering. So if you see, it's by that point 3 there. The great trials and tempests, right? That is telling you about someone going through troubled times. And then you also see long times of suffering. So that's also, troubled times. And we have, the Bible paints lots of pictures by, not in exactly the same way with stitches and hemistitches, but using different things to describe, or different like metaphors in a way to describe different things. Like Jesus, right? Jesus is called the lamb, and he's also called the lion, right? And it's kind of making a picture. So when I say the life-giving lamb, a lot of you would know, hey, that's Jesus we're talking about. And if I said the Lion of Judah, you would also know that that's Jesus I'm talking about. So if I said the life-giving lamb, the Lion of Judah, you would see that that is a stitch, right? And the letter, funny enough, I use L both times, but the letter that's tying it together, or the alliteration that's tying it all together, is life, lamb, and lion, right? That kind of keys it all together. Generally, hemistitches kind of are short and sweet. You see how these sentences are not too long, right? They're kind of short and skippy. They're not meant to be long, in-depth sentences. They're just supposed to give you an idea and to really help you paint that picture right in your head. So I hope that kind of explains it. And you can also pause the video and read here, right? One other thing just before I move on is that each little hemistitch, they're kind of supposed to be looked at in a sense as separate entities. Now they're both part of a whole, which is the stitch, but we have to look at them as semi-stitches, or hemistitches, not semi-stitches, hemistitches, right? As they're kind of individually hemistitches. They each individually paint the picture, and then they're taken together to paint a deeper picture, right? So sometimes when you're reading it, right, it's not like a regular sentence where you would see the location of learning, the great lesson hall. Normally we would say, we'd put like a conjunction in there. A lot of times they don't have that conjunction in the poetry. Now, this is obviously translated, and the poems and the stories that we dealt with directly didn't really have this in it because it can make it a little bit more complicated. But I think today it's a good time to learn a bit about these stitches and hemistitches, and to read, and I'll post a little bit of the Beowulf story with the stitches and hemistitches, so you can read through it and get an idea. Hey grade 5, this is Mr. B at a different time actually, because I was recording this and I kind of misspoke or overemphasized something, and I wanted to correct it because I think it's important that we get this all right. So I'm just going to go over the stitch thing and hemistitch thing again instead of just leaving the original one, because I want to be accurate. So a stitch, right, is a line in a Nordic poem or an Anglo-Saxon poem. And so it's a line, just like arrows flying above as archers reply. So that is a full stitch. Stitches, I think, as I said before, use alliteration to tie them together. So that's the main thing. And you see arrows flying above as archers reply, right? So there's 4 A's there that are emphasized, and knights knocked off horses by nasty needles, right? So then the N, or the N sound, is what is alliterated, right? So that is the major thing. And so in my last section there, I kind of, so I don't know if I'll put this in or not, but I overemphasized a certain type of stitch, which I'll get to in a moment. But yeah, the main thing is that it's a sentence that is, or a verse, basically, called a stitch, that is tied together through this alliteration. And alliteration, again, is when you have a repeated sound at the beginning of a word. Sometimes it can be within a word, but yeah. And so stitches always have one central theme, but they don't always repeat the same idea twice. So that's important to note, that sometimes it continues on the idea. So, right, arrows flying above as archers reply, right? It's not, it's continuing the idea. Sometimes they don't have conjunctions, sometimes they do. So the rules are not hard and fast on what to do with a stitch. Now the big idea that you need to know is that a stitch is made up of 2 hemistitches. And each hemistitch is like either side of the the comma there. Now, in some other writing styles, instead of putting the comma there, they'd put a slash or a double slash to indicate a break, right? So while these are together and they're tied together through the use of alliteration, they actually have to be viewed as almost like separate entities. Now, sometimes they're really tied in even closer with a conjunction like as or by, but sometimes they're not. And if you look below, the crunch of cold steel, the claws cut in deep, right? There's no conjunction, and that is fine with a stitch. You don't need the conjunction when you're making a stitch. They can be kind of separate sentences or separate entities in a sense, but they're still conjoined together, and they're conjoined more by the alliteration than by a conjunction word. And so you see that the crunch of cold steel, the claws cut in deep. The idea is it's painting one scene, right? It's talking about one thing, even if there's no conjunction. Again, though, there can be a conjunction, and we have in Beowulf, they say, they laid out their lord, beloved by all of them, right? So there's no conjunction there, but you can have a conjunction. So, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we had the right idea of stitches and hemistitches. So this next slide here, where I talked about them, this is a type of hemistitch, or a type of stitch that's really good, but it's pretty cool how they use it, but it's not always the case that it's used like this. So you have a lot more freedom in how you do it. So basically, what you're wanting to do when you create your own stitches is to create two kind of small little sections, or you make this sentence that has one side of the comma has just a few words, and make sure the alliteration is there. As long as the alliteration is there, that's tying in both, and it can have just like the location of learning, the Great Lesson Hall, right? It doesn't need to have a lot of alliteration. It can have just three words, but you have to make sure each side has an emphasis on the same letter sound, right? So that's all. I'm going to put this little section in here just as a clarification for you. So I hope that helps. Bye. Now we see kennings. Now, I didn't actually realize this, but it is so interesting. Right? Kennings are another literary device that are used in these poems. And they are actually kind of similar to a stitch. What they are is they're artistically saying something or describing something without simply saying the word, right? I could say cannon, or I could say iron flinger, right? What I'm creating there is a picture, right? I'm creating a picture using two words. So while a stitch uses two sentences to describe something, a kenning uses two words, maybe three, to link together, normally by a hyphen, to create an image, right? And so, it creates a picture, right? So instead of saying the sea, you say whale road, and this creates a picture, right? So that is an artistic way of using the language to make it more interesting and more fun. One downside of these things is that when you live 1,000 years out of away from the people who wrote the kennings, it's sometimes a little bit hard to figure out what exactly they mean. So some of them we can get, like whale road and being sea, but others sometimes can be a little bit more complicated, because if you don't live around their boats, you don't really know what they look like. You might not be able to get what they're talking about as easily. But I think it's very nice way of talking, and it kind of functions in a similar way to a stitch, right? So even in their whole poetic form tends to be taking two different, two segments, putting them together to create a whole, right? And so it's very artistic and creative that way. So basically a kenning is like a little metaphor. It's a mini 2-word metaphor, a comparison that doesn't use like or as. So it's not exactly a metaphor. So a metaphor generally would be like, you are the apple of my eye. And now that doesn't mean that they're literally the apple of my eye. but we're saying that that person is very sweet to me, right? And so we use this, right? Eye candy. That's something that I really enjoy to look at. And that is a kenning that we use in real life. And so eye candy almost captures the bigger metaphor of you are the apple of my eye in a short, sweet little 2-word mini metaphor. So yeah, and these are known as kennings. So here I just have a few. I have iron flingers, shield smasher, shield wall, right? So shield smasher, you can just see that axe smashing into a shield, just like it smashes into like wood, right? So you know that a sword, when it hits a shield, its surface area is a lot bigger, and so it struggles to break through a shield. But an axe with that long handle and the leverage, right? Remember we learned of the leverage? It smacks down really hard on the shields and can maybe smash them. And then iron flingers, you know, they blast off their big iron balls, and then my lead slingers, so that's riflemen shooting their lead rounds there. So that is kind of the idea. So now what I want you to do is go write your own little epic. So just a 10-stitch poem. I did one this morning while I was trying to figure out exactly what made up a stitch poem. So yeah, I would like you to go make that and then make one kenning in your poem somehow. Or if that's a bit of a struggle, you can make a kenning and put it to the side. And then what I want you to do is read it aloud, right? Because that's the way these things are supposed to be read. And when you deal with poetry, and a lot of reading, especially ancient reading, is meant to be read aloud. So anyways, I'd like you to go make your own, and hopefully you enjoy it as much as I did. Cheers then. Bye.